The Pavilion on the Links by Robert Louis Stevenson. Part 4. This was my wife's story, as I drew it from her among tears and sobs. Her name was Clara Huddleston. It sounded very beautiful in my ears, but not so beautiful as that other name of Clara Castless, which she wore during a longer and, I thank God, the happier portion of her life. Her father, Bernard Huddleston, had been a private banker in a very large way of business. Many years before, his affairs becoming disordered, he had been led to try dangerous, and at last criminal, expedients to retrieve himself from ruin. All was in vain. He became more and more cruelly involved, and found his honor lost at the same moment with his fortune. About this period, Northmore had been courting his daughter with great assiduity, though with small encouragement, and to him, knowing him thus disposed in his favor, Bernard Huddleston turned for help in his extremity. It was not merely ruin and dishonor, nor merely a legal condemnation, that the unhappy man had brought upon his head. It seems he could have gone to prison with a light heart. What he feared, what kept him awake at night or recalled him from slumber into frenzy, was some secret, sudden, and unlawful attempt upon his life. Hence, he desired to bury his existence and escape to one of the islands in the South Pacific, and it was in Northmore's yacht, the Red Earl, that he designed to go. The yacht picked them up clandestinely upon the coast of Wales, and had once more deposited them at Graden, till she could be refitted and provisioned for the longer voyage. Nor could Clara doubt that her hand had been stipulated as the price of passage. For, although Northmore was neither unkind nor even discourteous, he had shown himself in several instances somewhat overbold in speech and manner. I listened, I need not say, with fixed attention, and put many questions as to the more mysterious part. It was in vain. She had no clear idea of what the blow was, nor of how it was expected to fall. Her father's alarm was unfeigned and physically prostrating, and he had thought in more than once of making an unconditional surrender to the police. But the scheme was finally abandoned, for he was convinced that not even the strength of our English prisons could shelter him from his pursuers. He had had many affairs in Italy, and with Italians resident in London, in the latter years of his business, and these last, as Clara fancied, were somehow connected with the doom that threatened him. He had shown great terror at the presence of an Italian seaman on board the Red Earl, and had bitterly and repeatedly accused Northmore in consequence. The latter had protested that Beppo, that was the seaman's name, was a capital fellow, and could be trusted to the death, but Mr. Huddleston had continued ever since to declare that all was lost, that it was only a question of days, and that Beppo would be the ruin of him yet. I regarded the whole story as the hallucination of a mind shaken by calamity. He had suffered heavy loss by his Italian transactions, and hence the sight of an Italian was hateful to him, and the principal part in his nightmare would naturally enough be played by one of that nation. "What your father wants," I said, "is a good doctor and some calming medicine." "But Mr. Northmore," objected Clara. "He is untroubled by losses, and yet he shares in this terror." I could not help laughing at what I considered her simplicity. "My dear," said I, "you have told me yourself what reward he has to look for. All is fair in love, you must remember, and if Northmore foments your father's terrors, it is not at all because he is afraid of any Italian man, but simply because he is infatuated with a charming Englishwoman." She reminded me of his attack upon myself on the night of the disembarkation, and this I was unable to explain. In short, and from one thing to another, it was agreed between us that I should set out at once for the fisher village, Graden Wester, as it was called, look up all the newspapers I could find, and see for myself if there seemed any basis of fact for these continued alarms. The next morning, at the same hour and place, I was to make my report to Clara. She said no more on that occasion about my departure, nor, indeed, did she make it a secret that she clung to the thought of my proximity as something helpful and pleasant, and, for my part, I could not have left her, if she had gone upon her knees to ask it. I reached Graden Wester before 10 in the forenoon, for in those days I was an excellent pedestrian, and the distance, as I think I have said, was little over 7 miles, fine walking all the way upon the springy turf. The village is one of the bleakest on that coast, which is saying much. There is a church in the hollow, a miserable haven in the rocks, where many boats have been lost as they returned from fishing, 2 or 3 score of stone houses arranged along the beach and in 2 streets, one leading from the harbour, and another striking out from it at right angles, and, at the corner of these 2, a very dark and cheerless tavern, by way of principal hotel. I had dressed myself somewhat more suitably to my station in life, and at once called upon the minister in his little manse beside the graveyard. He knew me, although it was more than 9 years since we had met, and when I told him that I had been long upon a walking tour, and was behind with the news, readily lent me an armful of newspapers, dating from a month back to the day before. With these I sought the tavern, and, ordering some breakfast, sat down to study the Huddleston failure. It had been, it appeared, a very flagrant case. Thousands of persons were reduced to poverty, and one in particular had blown out his brains as soon as payment was suspended. It was strange to myself that while I read these details, I continued rather to sympathize with Mr. Huddleston than with his victims, so complete already was the empire of my love for my wife. A price was naturally set upon the banker's head, and, as the case was inexcusable and the public indignation thoroughly aroused, the unusual figure of £750 was offered for his capture. He was reported to have large sums of money in his possession. One day, he had been heard of in Spain, the next there was sure intelligence that he was still lurking between Manchester and Liverpool, or along the border of Wales, and the day after a telegram would announce his arrival in Cuba or Yucatan. But in all this there was no word of an Italian, nor any sign of mystery. In the very last paper, however, there was one item not so clear. The accountants who were charged to verify the failure had, it seemed, come upon the traces of a very large number of thousands which figured for some time in the transactions of the House of Huddleston, but which came from nowhere, and disappeared in the same mysterious fashion. It was only once referred to by name, and then under the initials XX, but it had plainly been floated for the first time into the business at a period of Great Depression some 6 years ago. The name of a distinguished royal personage had been mentioned by rumor in connection with this sum. The cowardly desperado, such, I remember, was the editorial expression, was supposed to have escaped with a large part of this mysterious fund still in his possession. I was still brooding over the fact, and trying to torture it into some connection with Mr. Huddleston's danger, when a man entered the tavern, and asked for some bread and cheese with a decided foreign accent. "Siete Italiano," said I. "Si, signor," was his reply. I said it was unusually far north to find one of his compatriots, at which he shrugged his shoulders, and replied that a man would go anywhere to find work. What work he could hope to find at Graydon Wester, I was totally unable to conceive, and the incident struck so unpleasantly upon my mind, that I asked the landlord, while he was counting me some change, whether he had ever before seen an Italian in the village. He said he had once seen some Norwegians, who had been shipwrecked on the other side of Graydon Ness and rescued by the lifeboat from Cold Haven. "No," said I, "but an Italian, like the man who has just had bread and cheese." "What?" cried he, "yon black-aviced fellow white the teeth. Was he an Italian?" "Well, yon's the first that ever I saw, and I dare say he's like to be the last." Even as he was speaking, I raised my eyes, and, casting a glance into the street, beheld 3 men in earnest conversation together, and not 30 yards away. One of them was my recent companion in the tavern parlor, the other 2, by their handsome sallow features and soft hats, should evidently belong to the same race. A crowd of village children stood around them, gesticulating and talking gibberish in imitation. The trio looked singularly foreign to the bleak, dirty street in which they were standing, and the dark grey heaven that overspread them, and I confess my incredulity received at that moment a shock from which it never recovered. I might reason with myself as I pleased, but I could not argue down the effect of what I had seen, and I began to share in the Italian terror. It was already drawing toward the close of the day before I had returned the newspapers to the manse, and got well forward onto the links on my way home. I shall never forget that walk. It grew very cold and boisterous, the wind sung in the short grass about my feet, thin rain showers came running on the gusts, and an immense mountain range of clouds began to arise out of the bosom of the sea. It would be hard to imagine a more dismal evening, and whether it was from these external influences, or because my nerves were already affected by what I had heard and seen, my thoughts were as gloomy as the weather. The upper windows of the pavilion commanded a considerable spread of links in the direction of Graden Wester. To avoid observation, it was necessary to hug the beach until I had gained cover from the higher sand hills on the little headland, when I might strike across through the hollows for the margin of the wood. The sun was about setting, the tide was low, and all the quicksands uncovered, and I was moving along, lost in unpleasant thought, when I was suddenly thunderstruck to perceive the prints of human feet. They ran parallel to my own course, but low down upon the beach, instead of along the border of the turf, and when I examined them, I saw at once by the size and coarseness of the impression, that it was a stranger to me and to those of the pavilion who had recently passed that way. Not only so, but from the recklessness of the course which he had followed, steering near to the most formidable portions of the sand, he was evidently a stranger to the country and to the ill repute of Graden Beach. Step by step I followed the prints, until, a quarter of a mile farther, I beheld them die away into the southeastern boundary of Graden Flow. There, whoever he was, the miserable man had perished. One or two gulls, who had perhaps seen him disappear, wheeled over his sepulchre with their usual melancholy piping. The sun had broken through the clouds by a last effort, and colored the wide level of quicksands with a dusky purple. I stood for some time gazing at the spot, chilled and disheartened by my own reflections, and with a strong and commanding consciousness of death. I remember wondering how long the tragedy had taken, and whether his screams had been audible at the pavilion. And then, making a strong resolution, I was about to tear myself away, when a gust fiercer than usual fell upon this quarter of the beach, and I saw, now whirling high in air, now skimming lightly across the surface of the sands, a soft, black, felt hat, somewhat conical in shape, such as I had remarked already on the heads of the Italians. I believe, but I am not sure, that I uttered a cry. The wind was driving the hat shoreward, and I ran round the border of the floe to be ready against its arrival. The gust fell, dropping the hat for a while upon the quicksand, and then, once more freshening, landed it a few yards from where I stood. I seized it with the interest you may imagine. It had seen some service, indeed, it was rustier than either of those I had seen that day upon the street. The lining was red, stamped with the name of the maker, which I have forgotten, and that of the place of manufacture, Venedig. This, it is not yet forgotten, was the name given by the Austrians to the beautiful city of Venice then, and for long after, a part of their dominions. The shock was complete. I saw imaginary Italians upon every side, and for the first, and, I may say, for the last time in my experience, became overpowered by what is called the panic terror. I knew nothing, that is, to be afraid of, and yet I admit that I was heartily afraid, and it was with sensible reluctance that I returned to my exposed and solitary camp in the sea wood. There I ate some cold porridge which had been left over from the night before, for I was disinclined to make a fire, and, feeling strengthened and reassured, dismissed all these fanciful terrors from my mind, and lay down to sleep with composure. How long I may have slept it is impossible for me to guess, but I was awakened at last by a sudden, blinding flash of light into my face. It woke me like a blow. In an instant I was upon my knees. But the light had gone as suddenly as it came. The darkness was intense, and, as it was blowing great guns from the sea, and pouring with rain, the noises of the storm effectually concealed all others. It was, I dare say, half a minute before I regained my self-possession. But for two circumstances, I should have thought I had been awakened by some new and vivid form of nightmare. First, the flap of my tent, which I had shut carefully when I retired, was now unfastened, and, second, I could still perceive, with a sharpness that excluded any theory of hallucination, the smell of hot metal and of burning oil. The conclusion was obvious. I had been awakened by someone flashing a bull's-eye lantern in my face. It had been but a flash, and away. He had seen my face, and then gone. I asked myself the object of so strange a proceeding, and the answer came pat. The man, whoever he was, had thought to recognize me, and he had not. There was another question unresolved, and to this, I may say, I feared to give an answer. If he had recognized me, what would he have done? My fears were immediately diverted from myself, for I saw that I had been visited in a mistake, and I became persuaded that some dreadful danger threatened the pavilion. It required some nerve to issue forth into the black and intricate thicket which surrounded and overhung the den, but I groped my way to the links, drenched with rain, beaten upon and deafened by the gusts, and fearing at every step to lay my hand upon some lurking adversary. The darkness was so complete that I might have been surrounded by an army and yet none the wiser, and the uproar of the gale so loud that my hearing was as useless as my sight. For the rest of that night, which seemed interminably long, I patrolled the vicinity of the pavilion, without seeing a living creature or hearing any noise but the concert of the wind, the sea, and the rain. A light in the upper story filtered through a cranny of the shutter, and kept me company till the approach of dawn.